So you didn't want to give me money? Well, you did answer the phone for me, so thank you. There we are. Yes, you did.
Did you find her in the echo there?
Yeah, she came right down here. Yeah, she came right down. Because I don't know what you're it's not, you know, it's working in the bind is not as bad as the mark. But
It's like that Pomeranian next door. Who? Me? I didn't know such. You would be Pomeranian.
And like once a month, the master hound will make a really loud bark, and you don't know where it comes from.
So should I come back?
Oh, look like the arm.
But you want all those sort of like exhibit number, not by item number, right?
I was just trying to get over here. No one's ever heard of it. Oh, did he? Do that? I love that. So he's subcontract. What's the general?
French here is called again. Here's one of the other. Sorry. 151, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Judge.
All right. Go to the back.
You're welcome. Okay, you have your witness.
I do, Judge. Can we approach before we bring the jury out?
Yes, you may be seated. Oh, wait a minute, I want that plea now.
There's no defendant. There's no defendant.
Oh. Tomorrow.
Thank you.
Take Marco.
Yes. Yeah, we're not taking her. No, I'm talking to the camera.
Not at all?
No, not at her. Not her at all.
No voice, no nothing?
Oh, well, boys, no.
Okay.
There's no face.
Right.
Yeah.
All rise for the jury.
You may be seated. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I received a stipulation that the jurors are present and properly seated.
They are good.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me roll. You swing the microphone in front of you. All right, today, about the examination.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Detective.
Good afternoon.
You had mentioned that, in prosecutor's questions, that you've been employed in the cyber crimes unit since the end of March. Is that 2016?
Yes.
Previous to that point, obviously, you were a member of the Detroit Police Department.
Yes.
And how long were you serving in that capacity?
I was hired by the Detroit Police Department June 26, 2000, and I've been in various positions. My position prior to cyber crimes, I was a detective at the 4th Precinct.
And leading up to the being promoted to the rank of detective, did you hold various jobs that led up to that?
I was a patrol officer. I was in different units, but primarily on patrol as a street officer prior to becoming a detective.
Okay. I understand what you're talking about, the XRY software, and I think you gave a thorough explanation of what it is, but would you consider that, if you know, that's fairly recent technology, would you agree?
I'm not sure when that software was created.
Do you happen to know, based on your experience in that unit, is this technology widely used throughout the state, or do you know the answer to that question?
A lot of law enforcement agencies do use forensic extraction software, yes.
And am I correct in assuming that in order to, just to use police vernacular, to dump that phone, you need to get a warrant or search warrant, or is that not necessary?
Well, there are two ways of having authorization to extract data from a phone. We would either use a consent to search, which would have to be signed by the owner or possessor of the phone, or through a search warrant, yes.
In this particular case, was it the former or the latter? Meaning, did the complaining witness, did she sign off on it, or did you have to obtain a warrant?
The complaining witness signed a consent to search form.
And is that, my vernacular is correct when I call it dumping the phone? I mean, that's typically what someone in your position would call it. You've heard that expression before.
The dumping a phone is the same as extracting the data from a phone. It is more police terminology to say we dumped the phone. It means the same thing though.
Thank you. Now, am I correct in assuming, just so you can explain this to the jury a little bit more, that if I have my cell phone, for example, and I go through and I say, I'm going to delete, all these texts from this person, or I'm going to delete these photos, these photos are never, or this information is never truly deleted. You're able to retrieve that information for the most part, correct?
That depends on each phone. There are a lot of different variables that play into whether we can or cannot retrieve deleted data. There are also variables that play into how that deleted data is able to be extracted and then compiled into a readable form. It may be incomplete, it may be it may look differently. Just for example, if I may,
Sure.
The text message may be cut off in the middle. Every phone, when data is deleted, it goes into different areas within the phone that is just kind of like trash space. So the deleted data may still be there. It stays there for a time period until it's just a continuous writing to the trash. So as this fills up, it just knocks off the oldest one that had been deleted. And the text or any data that is deleted may go into different spots. Just for an example, the sentence from a text may go into this part of a trash can. The date and time may go into this part, and then the phone number to or from may go into this part. So when the extraction is done, we do, our software does attempt to recover deleted data and then put it back together. But because it's deleted and because we don't know how many times it may or may not have been, overwritten, I don't know how many times people delete certain things. So the deleted data will show up possibly in a format that is incomplete, dates or times, or other parts of that message may not be there at all.
And you anticipated my next line of questioning. And tell me if this is not a correct statement. Is it, based on what you just explained to the jury, is it not unlike a puzzle where one part of a text message may be unretrievable or could possibly be encrypted? And by encrypted, I mean a language that's not written in English, in ABCs. It's written in what looks like gibberish. And is that part of what you are trained to do, or the software is designed to do, to sort of put that puzzle back together, try to find this part from this part of the phone, try to find this piece of the text message from another part? Am I oversimplifying it, or is that correct?
The software will attempt to put the pieces back together, sort of like a puzzle. It is all going to be dependent on how much data is stored in the phone, when that information was deleted. There can be just a number of variables that are dependent on the phone itself, what type of storage space it has, how much has been deleted. The software updates that we use also could play a role if it's something that, like an application that has recently had a new update to that application. The software does the best it can to recognize it and extract it and put it back together.
Just in response to one of your previous answers, it's relatively new technology. Would you consider it to be a precise, foolproof method of retrieving this data and putting it into where the puzzle pieces are supposed to go?
I wouldn't consider anything foolproof. Technology is being updated on a daily basis. We do, with each extraction, I check the software and the program for any available updates. I update it as the developers update it. But again, with the nature of electronic devices, they're being updated so often that I can't say that anything is foolproof.
I imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that your unit is a small unit. You're not the only person that's manning the store, so to speak, are you?
I'm not. We are made up of 5 people, 1 sergeant, 3 detectives, 1 police officer.
And is it safe to assume that your unit is a relatively newer unit or addition to the Detroit Police Department?
Yes. The end of March, the Detroit Police Department created the cyber crimes unit, and I was one that was transferred.
Now, we've seen in the newspaper and so forth that some of the other municipalities, police divisions have used. Am I safe in assuming that your unit is not just meant for retrieving data from a phone? Is it also used for what we've seen on the news, like sexual predators and so forth, using the internet? Is that part of what your duties would be?
We do investigate crimes that are of a cybercrime nature. That could include some type of sexual offense. It could include anything that is done on the internet, through social media, through phones. the way that cases are assigned up to my bosses. He will investigate some crime.
So, both sides, we have just tons of paperwork here. I'm not sure of the exact phone. Was it a Motorola phone that you dumped in this case, or what brand was it?
It was the white Samsung.
Samsung.
Yes.
Was it a Galaxy phone, or do you remember?
It was a Galaxy S4.
Okay. Is that one of the phones that you are able to extract data from?
When I open up the extraction software, there is a list of phones that the software immediately recognizes by a make. There are times when the exact make will not be in the list. However, we can check if the software will automatically detect it and recognize it by the make that it is, Samsung Galaxy. There are also other ways to check if they are compatible. So, if you'd like an example of what I'm talking
Yes,
about?
please.
If, just for example purposes, throwing out numbers, if it's the make or the model number is 123. If the 123 is not in there exactly as it is, I could go to the 122 or the 124, the model that is directly above or below, and attempt to extract the data that way also.
Would you consider the phone from the complaining witness that I'm going to use a vernacular because I can't remember what you call it, that you dumped or extracted the data from? Do you feel that you were successful in retrieving data that was correct? I mean, the puzzle was put together, so to speak.
Well, when I received the phone, I was told that the target information basically was March 22nd, March 23rd, through communications, phone calls, texts, apps that could communicate in some way. So when I did the extraction, I also went back and reviewed the phone content itself from the actual phone and compared it to what my report was saying. I do that to make sure that I'm able to get what is on the phone at that time, and I also verify the way that it looks in the report. Like I explained before with the Signal app and the way that the software extracts it, it doesn't extract it into a nice little conversation list. It kind of splits it up or parses it out. So when I run across something like that, then I do the screenshots of the device, the phone itself, so that it can be reviewed. The software extracted it, but it didn't put it in a nice, understandable format for the layperson to understand and read.
So it's not like, I'm sure everyone here has some sort of device or phone that they can relate to. It's not like if I looked up, if I was having a text conversation with my law partner, it wouldn't be all in chronological and time-stamped, and that's not the way when you dump the phone it comes out.
Well, it depends on what is on the phone. The texting may come up in chronological order, but it also breaks it down to SMS or MMS. So if you are texting, depending on what format you're texting, if you both have Apple phones and you're doing SMS, then it would show up in that way. If sometimes I have a text that is unable to send and I get the option, would you like to send, as a regular text message, then that is an MMS message. With the applications, the online applications, the program, the software that we use, it does the best that it can to recognize what data it's pulling from, but in order to verify that, I go back into the phone to be able to look at it myself.
Okay. Let me ask you this specifically. Let's go back to the exhibits and the questions that the prosecutor asked you. And she showed you a series of photographs that were admitted into evidence. You remember seeing those, correct?
Yes.
That's before we broke for lunch, right?
Right.
Okay. And there were messages, and there were, I believe on at least one of those exhibits, there was a picture of a map.
Correct.
And you had a conversation, you testified with the prosecutor, correct?
Yes.
Do you know if that was something either identical or similar to what we would refer to as Google Maps, something like that?
It would be similar to, a similar style to like a Google Map type thing.
Okay. And I know there was also some conversations that were going on back and forth that you were able to retrieve, but based on what you told me already today, you can't be 100% certain that those messages were sent on that day or at that time. Is that correct? Is that
Well,
a safe statement?
I can see that those messages were sent and received as well as those calls, whether they were answered or not, from that day that's time-stamped in both the extraction report and on the phone from that device.
Well, there's obviously, we're all familiar with the mystery of why sometimes someone sends a text message at midnight and it doesn't come in until 7 o'clock the next night. Is that something that you would encounter, or you can explain why that happens? I don't know. Is that something you can answer?
Not really, no. I can't explain the delay in delivery of a text.
Okay, so I guess my point is this: you can't, with, I hate to use percentages, but you can't say with a degree of certainty that those texts were sent or received at the times that they were stamped in those pictures, can you?
I can say that based on the report from the data extraction of the phone, comparing it to what was on the phone itself, the times, dates and times coincide.
Okay. Were you able to retrieve any data from Mr. Muntean's phone?
I only received one phone.
That wasn't Mr. Muntean's phone?
I received the white Samsung Galaxy S4 from what was told to me belonged to Natalia Muntean. That is who signed the consent.
And Mrs. Muntean is the person that actually signed the consent form to allow you to do the dump, correct?
Correct.
Or the extraction, my apologies.
Correct.
Okay. Just so I'm correct on what you testified to previously, if you recall, did you see any calls to 911 or texts that were discovered during the extraction? And I should say during that period from the 22nd to the 23rd.
During the 22nd and 23rd, I did not.
Okay. Were any of the texts outside of the ones that have been introduced into evidence, did any of them include "I'm in danger," "call for help," anything like that?
Nothing that I observed.
And I thought I was fairly accurate writing down the times, but it looked like there was about a 3-hour window that you were focusing on, around the 7 o'clock to about 10 p.m. on the 22nd. Is that correct?
That's approximate times, yes. That was from that specific conversation through the Signal app.
The last thing I want to ask you is, we've been focusing on text messages, but you also said there was phone activity during that time. Namely, there were phone calls being either placed or received during that time period, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I have no further questions, Jim.
Redirect.
Exactly. Let's go right to the phone calls that defense counsel just asked you about. I believe you testified on direct those phone calls were made through the Signal app.
Yes, the Signal app is an internet-based application where you can text, make phone calls, send pictures, that type of app.
And did you analyze the phone and determine if there were any other calls made outside of the calls and texts that we discussed through the Signal app?
I did both on the report and on the phone itself look for phone calls, text messages, and conversations through Signal.
Did you look outside of Signal as well, like on the actual phone itself and on the text message system
Yes,
that comes in the phone?
The actual phone calls through the carrier. The text message, on the phone there's an icon for text messages, there is an icon for phone calls, and then there's an icon for the Signal application, and I checked all of those.
And aside from what we've already discussed now for quite some time, aside from the Signal communications, those texts and calls that we've gone over, there were no other calls, no other text messages that were made after 6 p.m. on March 22nd. Is that correct?
After, I believe the last one was closer to 10 on the 22nd.
Outside of the Signal.
Oh, I'm sorry, outside of the Signal app. There were none, the Signal app was the latest type of communication. There was nothing past that time frame on any other portion of the phone that I found.
Okay. And then defense counsel was asking some questions about deleted items of data, and they have a detailed answer about that and extracting that. Were you able to find deleted data on this phone?
I was able to find some deleted data, yes.
And did you analyze that and look for deleted things from March 22nd, 2016?
The deleted data that I found was incomplete. I was unable to determine dates or times or even complete messages.
And did you nonetheless look to see if anything was relevant within that?
Yes, I did.
And you did not find anything?
I did not.
One moment, Judge. Nothing else, Judge.
Very well.
No
You
question.
close. All right. You may step down. You may call your next witness.
So at this time, the people call Sarah Barr.
Step up here.
Swear or affirm that the testimony or about given in their opinion before this court is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
B-A-R-R.
All right. You may proceed.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Could you please state your name and introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Sarah Barr.
And Ms. Barr, how are you employed?
I'm a forensic scientist in the biology unit of the Michigan State Police.
And how long have you been employed there?
I've been employed there for about 2.5 years.
And what do you do as a forensic scientist at the Michigan State Police?
In my capacity as the biology unit, I perform body fluid identification and forensic DNA analysis. When evidence is submitted to the laboratory from an investigating agency, the evidence is then looked at for any body fluids that might be present, and samples are collected from that evidence, and those samples are processed for DNA.
And in order to do this, do you have to have any type of special training?
Yes.
What type of training did you have?
Should I go into my education as well?
Yes, please, start there.
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree in human biology from Michigan State University, as well as a master's degree in forensic science from Marshall University, with emphasis in crime scene investigation and forensic DNA analysis. And once I was hired at the Michigan State Police, I completed a training course in which I completed different modules, which are just sections for each part of my job. And for each of those modules, I had to complete competency tests. And then at the end, I did 3 competency cases, a competency exam that encompassed everything that I had learned, as well as a mock trial.
In this formal training that you've told us about, does this include training in the analysis of DNA?
Yes.
And I should start just in case. What is DNA?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the basic building block of all life. It is unique to every individual, with the exception of identical twins. You get half of your DNA from your mother and the other half from your father.
Okay. And did you, part of your education, did that include researching on DNA analysis and forensic science and things of that nature?
Yes, and it included reading scientific articles from the forensic DNA community.
Okay. And have you been qualified as an expert in court before?
Yes,
How many times?
I've been qualified 7 times.
Have you been qualified in this court, the Third Circuit Court, before?
Yes,
How many times?
6 times.
Just at this point, I would ask to tender Ms. Barr as an expert in forensic science and body fluid identification.
Judge, I don't object, but I'd like the opportunity to supply the error.
You may do that now.
Good afternoon, Ms. Barr.
Good afternoon.
You received your master's degree, you say, from Marshall University?
Yes,
That was in,
it was in forensic, the master's degree is in forensic science with 2 emphases in crime scene investigation and forensic DNA analysis.
have you published any articles?
No,
How long have you been an employee of the Michigan State Police?
approximately 2.5 years.
So you're not a police officer, you're a scientist, correct?
Correct.
And you testified, as a prosecutor asked you, as an expert, or have you testified just giving your opinion as a scientist in other trials?
Yeah,
In total, how many times have you testified at trial?
including one time just giving my opinion as an expert. That would be 8 times.
Judge, just one quick second, please.
You may.
Judge, we would stipulate to Ms. Barr's credentials as an expert.
Very well. The witness may testify as an expert in that field.
Thank you, Judge.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Ma'am, I want to go back to DNA a little bit. We've talked about it. How is DNA found?
Do you mean in the context of forensic DNA analysis?
Yes, sorry, my fault. Let me specify that a little bit. In the context of forensic science, and specifically in your work, how do you find DNA? From where do you get it?
DNA can be found in almost any cell in the body. From crime scenes and examined for body fluids. These body fluids can include blood, semen, and saliva, hairs, and all of those fluids contain DNA. And so those samples are collected of those body fluids, and we analyze those for forensic DNA analysis.
Can DNA also be transferred from one person to an object through touch?
Yeah.
And is that another way that you can possibly detect DNA?
Yes, we can swab those items in hopes of collecting any skin cells that may have been deposited.
And when you, in the course of your work, you received evidence that was collected at crime scenes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. When you receive that evidence, what do you do with it?
The first thing we do is we examine that evidence. We break it down and give a description of the item that we've received, and then we perform testing on those items if any stains are observed.
Do you also give the evidence that you receive a lab number?
Yes.
Okay. And what do you do that for?
Every piece of evidence that is submitted into the laboratory is given a unique identifier, and that helps us not only identify it for cases of the court, it also helps us track it for an individual chain of custody.
And are those numbers different than the numbers that they might arrive at the lab with? Like a number that's given, let's say, by a police department? Are those 2 separate numbers?
Yes. The investigating agency will have their own separate number for the evidence. Well, when the evidence is submitted, I will give it a unique identifier for the laboratory.
Okay. And after you look at that evidence, you review it, what happens?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, so once you receive the evidence and you are beginning to test it, how do you begin to test it?
I examine the evidence for any clues that might be present, and it does depend on the context of the case. Usually we ask for a statement of facts from the investigating agency, just to give us an idea, give me an idea of what I should be looking for. However, depending on what the evidence looks like, then I can perform different types of testing to determine what the staining is.
And so you're initially looking for that bodily fluid in order to get the DNA, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And you perform certain tests on those pieces of evidence in order to discover whether there's body fluid, right?
Yeah.
Okay. If you discover that there's body fluid, what's the next step that happens?
A sample is collected of that stain, and that sample is placed in a tube, and that is placed in the property room, and next a DNA scientist will take that sample into their possession and perform forensic DNA analysis.
Okay. And I want to draw your attention now to lab number NB162547. Did you receive evidence from the Tripsis department and give it that lab number?
Yes.
And does that case concern Radu Muntean and Natalia Muntean?
Yes.
And did you analyze that evidence in the way that you've been describing?
Yes.
Prior to you analyzing the evidence, did another scientist work on that?
That was correct.
And who was that?
That was Rebecca Scaglin.
And did she do the test, the initial test, to determine if there was that bodily fluid there?
Yes.
And at that point, she then sent those samples, those swabs you were telling us about, to you?
Yes.
Okay. Now, once you received those swabs, can you tell us a little bit about what you did in this case, about the evidence you received? Would it help? I'm going to show you what's been pre-marked identification as People's Proposed Exhibit 164. And while I approach, once you determine all of your findings and make your findings and conclusions, do you place them in a report?
Yeah.
And is that report given the same lab number of the items of evidence that you've analyzed?
That is correct.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been pre-marked People's Proposed Exhibit 164. Can you take a look at that? Is that the report that you prepared in this case?
Yeah.
Concerning the items of evidence that you received from the Tripsis report?
That's correct.
Okay. So just a kind of to admit People's Exhibit 164.
No objection, Judge.
Shall be received.
Okay. You can keep that up there. So, what types of evidence did you receive from Ms. Scaglin?
Okay. For this case, the types of evidence that I received are as follows. Evidence NB162547-1A1, the sample labeled possible blood staining from roll of duct tape. NB16-2547-2A is possible blood staining from apparent hairs. NB16-2547-3A is possible blood staining from right front door handle. NB16-2547-4A is possible blood staining from seat cushion of center console. NB16-2547-5A is labeled Natalia Muntean known buckle.
I'm going to stop you for a second. What is a buckle?
A buccal swab is simply a swab that's collected from someone's mouth. The mouth is also referred to as a buccal cavity. So the idea is to collect some of the skin cells from your cheek so that this sample can create a DNA profile that we know is from that individual.
And that's what it means by known buckle.
Correct.
Okay, so you know for that lab number 16-25475A that you just told us about, you know that that swab is Natalia Muntean's DNA on that swab.
Well, I can tell you that this is what the sample was labeled as.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, please go on to the next item.
NB16-2547-6A is labeled Radu Muntean known buckle. And NB16-2547-7A1 was possible blood staining from jacket.
Okay. Once you had those items, tell us what you did in order to analyze them.
Okay, for the DNA analysis process, the very first step is to pull the DNA off of whatever substance that DNA has been deposited on. In this case, it was a portion of a swab. So it's called extracting that DNA. The very next step, I try to figure out how much DNA is in that sample. The next step is called amplification. So for this step, I'm actually looking at very specific locations on the DNA, and I am making billions and billions of copies of those specific locations.
And how are you doing that? How are you making the copies?
So it's through a process called PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. For PCR, there are three main phases. The very first phase, I separate the DNA strands. In the second phase, I actually put something called a primer on that specific location. It's made to bind to that one location. And then the third phase, an enzyme comes in and builds an exact copy of that location. And that's considered one cycle. And that happens for many cycles, and so we're creating many, many copies of that.
Okay. What's the next step after amplification?
Okay, the next step is separation. So I'm actually separating out all those little fragments that I just made. And I'm separating them by the size and the number of those fragments. And the computer can read that, and it generates what we call a DNA profile.
And what do you do once you have a DNA profile?
Then I can examine this profile and make determinations.
Okay. So determinations like what?
For example, how many individuals are present, and I can make comparisons to any references that have been presented to me.
Okay. And how many of those steps did you take with the swabs that you received in this case?
In this case, I went all the way through to the interpretation phase. And when I examined the profiles during the interpretation phase, I noticed that one of the profiles, the possible blood staining from the roll of duct tape, is what we call a mixture. So there is more than one person's DNA present in the sample.
Okay. And based on that information, what did you do then?
Well, I noticed that it was a more complex mixture, and the state police has just purchased a new type of software that helps interpret mixtures. So I talked to another analyst who was qualified in the software. I have not been qualified in it yet, and he said this case would be eligible for this software, and so I handed all of the profiles over to him.
Did you make any determinations as it related to the remaining items, the remaining swabs?
When I looked at the remaining profiles that I had generated, I made the determination that they were all from a single individual.
Okay. I want to go back a little bit now and ask about the precautions that you take in the lab so that you don't contaminate the samples. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do so that doesn't happen?
Okay, I take many precautions to make sure that contamination doesn't happen. So I wear some protective equipment, such as a lab coat, gloves, and a mask. I wipe down my lab bench with 10% bleach before and after working in the laboratory. I only have one sample open at a time, and I always process my evidence samples before my reference samples.
What does that mean, processing your evidence samples before your reference samples?
So it is a requirement from the FBI quality assurance standards that all evidence samples, which is our evidence collected from crime scenes, must be processed before the reference samples, which we know come from certain individuals.
Okay. And why is it that way?
Well, the evidence samples can be very sensitive. With evidence samples, there's not always a chance that we can go back.
Okay.
So with reference samples, they're from known individuals. There's usually a large amount of DNA, and usually you can go back and collect another sample. So we take special care to process the evidence samples in a separate space at a separate time to keep the evidence integrity.
Okay. Is there also a concern, is one of the reasons why you do that, so that you don't cross-contaminate with a reference sample being tested first and then maybe being deposited on the evidence kit?
Correct. And that's also the reason that I open one sample at a time, because I don't want to cross-contaminate between the evidence samples as well.
Okay. And just to be clear, the evidence that you received was swabs that were taken by Rebecca Scavlin after she looked at those items that she received. Is that true?
Well, what I received was portions of swabs. I'm not sure what the original evidence looked like.
Okay, so you saw the swabs that she took.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. And those were swabs that she had labeled as possible blood staining, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. And then once you handed over your conclusions, is that in the analysis that you did in this case?
Yes.
One moment, Judge. And just to be clear, you did not determine who the samples were from, correct?
Correct.
That would be somebody else.
Yes, I did not make any comparisons.
Okay. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Judge. Would it be a true statement to say that DNA, that is, the more people that handle the DNA sample before it gets to you in the lab, the more chances there are for contamination of that sample? Is that a true statement?
Yeah.
So do you know, in fact, in this particular instance, how many people either had access to or handled that DNA before it arrived at your microscope?
I know the number of people in my laboratory that handled the samples. However, before it got to my laboratory, I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Have you personally had the opportunity to analyze DNA samples that have come from a specific type of crime scene where there were a lot of individuals present?
Yeah.
Who typically is the first in the chain of custody? And that simply means, correct me if I'm wrong, chain of custody and command is who has control of that sample from the minute that it's collected until it reaches your desk. Is that person typically an evidence technician that would be part of the police force or someone that works for law enforcement or the government?
It really depends on the agency. It could be an evidence technician. Sometimes it is the investigating officer.
So you personally, I mean, you don't go out and collect the samples, correct?
I do go to crime scenes, but it depends on the case.
On this specific case, you didn't go to the crime scene, right?
No.
Collect different samples.
No.
Okay. And your results were inconclusive based on your prosecutor's question? And is that a safe statement? Is that a true statement?
Well, my results were not inconclusive. I simply made the determination of the number of individuals in the profiles, and then I handed them to another individual to draw more conclusions.
You're familiar with CODIS, correct?
Yes.
CODIS, just to oversimplify because I'm as far away from the scientist as possible, but CODIS would be similar to a fingerprint database, correct? Would that be a safe assumption? But this is for DNA.
It's similar, yeah.
Someone that has supplied a DNA sample in the past, whether it be under a criminal investigation or conviction, and that DNA is added to the CODIS database, correct?
Yeah.
So then therefore it's easy to make the next step and say the sample that you have in front of you, you could run through CODIS and see if there's a match, correct?
Well, it depends. There are a lot of rules about what can and cannot go into CODIS.
In this specific case, were you able to, or did you compare the samples you were provided with the CODIS database?
I did not.
Was there a specific reason that you didn't do that in this case?
Before this new software, since we're already, the individual who is going to be working on the software is going to be drawing the final conclusions, I have been instructed to wait until let me rephrase. I am not entering anything into CODIS that individual will be making the determination whether or not something will be compared to notice.
So I was a little confused. There's, and I forget the individual's name that was referenced by the prosecutor, but someone before you, obviously someone before you collected the samples, but then they were sent to the lab and one of your colleagues performed another duty in the lab before it got to you. Is that correct?
Yes.
And exactly what did this person do?
We call it body fluid identification.
What is that?
So that is looking for and testing any potential stains for body fluids.
So you previously testified, you answered my question, and you said that you have been at crime scenes and you have been in a position to collect DNA samples. That's a true statement, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So is it crucial to prevent contamination of that DNA sample? Because I believe the perception is that DNA is foolproof. But is it crucial of anyone that's involved in that chain of custody, whether it be law enforcement, an evidence technician, someone in your lab other than you, so anyone that's handled that, is it true, it's a true statement that strict measures have to be implemented to prevent contamination of that sample? Is that a true statement?
Yeah.
Okay. So things like extreme temperatures, extreme cold, or more specifically, extreme heat can affect those samples, correct?
Yeah.
Significantly. They can provide what, in a layman's term, a false positive, making a false identification. Is that a safe assumption?
Well, I've never read any studies as to the effect of temperature. However, we try to keep all of our evidence at room temperature at my laboratory.
Okay, so say for example, it was a very cold environment or a very hot environment, and the sample was taken, but the sample was put into a plastic bag. Not by you, but by an evidence technician. In your opinion, would that be a mistake?
Yeah.
And why is that?
At the crime scene, I try to package all of the biological evidence in paper bags because if the evidence is collected in plastic bags, it can cause mold to grow, which can affect our analysis.
And that's simply because the plastic bag has a possibility or potential for water retention inside the bag, which would contaminate the sample, correct?
Yes.
Do you know, if you do know, when this was collected, was it placed in a paper bag or was it placed in a plastic bag, or how did you receive it?
Since I did not see the original evidence, I don't know.
Because of the, and I'm not sure what you're aware of or what you're not, so I'm going to ask you a question. If there's a crime scene where there's several people on the scene, and there's someone that's handling a DNA sample, is it important for that person who's collecting it to wear gloves?
Yeah.
That would be a no-brainer. That would be extremely important to not contaminating that sample, correct?
Yeah.
If there are a lot of people that could potentially be in contact. Now, for example, if an evidence tech is bending over and collecting a blood sample, but there are other people present, it's possible for that sample to be contaminated in a number of ways, correct?
It's possible.
Not by anything the evidence tech is doing is wrong, but people that are standing around, for example, if they were to cough or sneeze in the general area, potential for contamination is present, correct?
Yep.
And that's something I'm sure you try, as you indicated on the record, something you've tried to eliminate for you specifically when you're analyzing a DNA sample, specifically blood.
Yeah.
So if you're taking a blood sample from an item of clothing, aren't there inherent problems with taking a sample from an item of clothing?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Let me rephrase that. Because it's an item of clothing, you don't know what's come before that. before the DNA or the blood sample is collected. You don't know if moisture has come into the fabric. You don't know if pieces of the fabric have actually been absorbed or vice versa into the blood, correct? You don't know that.
I don't know.
But that's a potential for contamination of that sample, right?
Yeah.
Lastly, is one of the methods you would use if there are a lot of people at the scene, what's called an elimination sample. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
And briefly, could tell me if I'm right or wrong. It's to rule out that there's confusion in the DNA of who it's being identified or attributed to, because there's a lot of people around. So there's a certain, I don't know what the science is, but I'm sure you would. What is the scientific makeup of doing the elimination sample? How do you do that specifically?
An elimination sample is simply a reference sample from another individual that the investigating agency feels might be a possible contributor to a DNA profile. So it's simply another reference profile that I can generate and compare to the evidence profile.
So in this layman's terms, if there were 10 people at the crime scene that may have been in the general area of this sample, the procedure would be to take swabs from those individuals and then compare them to what you have, correct?
Yeah.
That's probably as basic as I can explain it, but I'm correct in stating it that way?
Yeah.
I have no further questions, Jim.
Read the right.
Just briefly, Judge. So, Ms. Barr, just to be clear, in this case, your basic conclusions were that with respect to the first portion of the swab you analyzed, you determined that it was, I believe it was 1A. You determined that there was DNA from 2 contributors, correct?
I determined there was DNA of multiple contributors. I didn't give a specific number.
Okay. And then as to the rest of the samples that you analyzed, you determined that there was 1 contributor
Yeah.
of DNA.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question.
Withdraw.
Just one quick follow-up. Multiple contributors, does that mean what we were just talking about in terms of the elimination sample? That was your conclusion?
It simply means that there's more than one person contributing to this profile. I didn't make any sort of comparison.
Okay. So theoretically, it could have came from anybody that was at the crime scene, correct?
Theoretically, yes.
No questions, Judge.
All right. You may step down. Short recess.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, thank you.
You may be seated.
Yes, sir. Okay, okay. Which